What's up, all? Welcome back to the question where you have the questions and I have the answers. And I know I haven't made a video in a very long time. I said over the summer that I was going to stop making videos because YouTube is benefiting the Israeli government, and I wasn't going to make a video until Palestine is free. And I still believe in that, but honestly, I think I was just looking for an excuse to leave YouTube. I've been making these videos for a lot of my life now, and I haven't achieved big YouTube fame or success. And so part of me was really just like, why am I doing this? It's become really more of a chore to do this. This was the same thing with my TikTok, so I left TikTok for a while as well. And same thing with my Instagram. I stopped posting on Instagram too. I think I just needed a break from making content to really figure out why I make content, what do I want to be doing in the first place, and also just like, I just didn't have time with all the really huge things I've been doing this last quarter, this past year. I didn't have the mental, emotional capacity or like physical time to make these videos. And even though they're very low quality videos, I like them, and it does take a hot minute for me to do them. And so finding out that YouTube was on the like no thanks app, like don't use boycott list, I was like, okay, this gives me an excuse to take a break. And so you're probably thinking, well, if it's still on the boycott list, why are you making a video now? And it's because I realized that I know a lot, and I think a lot, and I've experienced a lot, and I've done a lot of research for my major, for my career, and me keeping all of that knowledge to myself is not going to benefit anybody. And so if this is how people are getting their information, if this is how people are communicating to each other about these crises, about everything that's happening in the world, and there is so much happening in the world, it's beneficial if I keep posting on here. And because I have a friend who started watching my channel and said even though like it's clear my videos are low quality, I put a lot of time and effort into making them, and that made me feel really appreciated, and it made me want to keep going because I know at least one person is out here watching my videos and learning things from them and engaging in the discussions that I'm having with myself and hopefully with my audience, and that makes it worth it. So today I struggled a lot on what is my first video about going to be. Originally, I was going to make a video about what is going on with Ben and Jerry's, and I might make one about that later. But a post that I saw online is really hitting with me. Not hitting, but like it's stuck in my mind. And it's by a person on Instagram called Roots Metal. She is a Latina Jew. She's from Mexico. And she makes a lot of informational posts about Jewish things that are happening, whether culture, history, Israel, or just current discourse about the Jewish identity and Israel, which is why I follow her, because I use a lot of her posts, a lot of her hot takes, and the people that engage with her for the research that I use for my thesis, which is why I took a lot of interest into the most recent post that she made, which was about many things. But the things that stuck out to me was, one, the ongoing drama with J Street, which maybe I'll make another post on either YouTube, Instagram, or TikTok about the current drama unfolding between the big Jewish organizations, which are the ADL, JVP, and J Street, as well as APAC. But her use of the term, and probably, I think, she didn't coin the term, but she uses it the most often, I think probably popularized it, the term as a Jews, and why that term bothers me so much. And so I think what today I'm going to talk about are the messy identity politics of American Judaism. So to start off, what is an as a Jew? Me. It's me. Or at least I would fall into that category. To Roots Metal and to many other pro-Israel Jewish content creators, people on Jew Talk, individuals and organizations, and as a Jew is somebody who is anti-Zionist, non-Zionist, or pro-Palestine, or just not explicitly pro-Israel, who begins their statements with, well, as a Jew, da 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 da. Basically, they believe it's Jews who are either self-tokenizing or have been tokenized by the pro-Palestine group or by other dissenting groups to prove that their point is not anti-Semitic, to argue against pro-Israel arguments, to argue against Israel. Essentially, it is claiming that, like, this is the modern form of, like, the self-hating Jew, is the as a Jew. Because Jews who are of this stance assert their Jewish identity in order to say, hey, like, I'm going to say this is not anti-Semitic, and I have grounds to say this because as a Jewish individual, I don't find this anti-Semitic, or I have argument / proof / whatever to say that it's not anti-Semitic, or I have grounds. Basically, asserting identity as a way to exert expertise in an area, which in itself is inherently problematic because there's experts in this area, and then there's people who say they have an opinion because it's their identity, which I think is valid. I think especially in discourses around identity and things being done within the names of identities, those who are of that identity have the right to fully exert their opinion as a member of that identity. But I think also this gets into the identity politics, which we're talking about today, where certain forms, an ideology of an identity is asserted over the reality of an identity. I'll get into that later. But that's essentially what an as a Jew is. And I say that technically qualifies as me because I am not pro-Israel. I fall into the anti-Zionist, non-Zionist, pro-Palestine circles. And while I don't start things with as a Jew, I do assert myself as a Jew in these spaces and in conversations to assert that, like, hey, mainly it's because when people talk about Jewish things or Jewish topics, they assume that there aren't Jews in the room. And so they will take on this ideological Jewish stance, this ideology of the Jewish community, to be like, well, this is what Jews want. And it's like, well, actually, there are Jews in the room who don't agree with this ideology. And I think that's the problem, is that when we come into issues with, like, the self-hating Jew, the as a Jew, the self-tokenizing Jew, we erase the complexity of the American Jewish community. And this isn't just true for the American Jewish community. This is true for all communities, all marginalized communities. Because, like, there is dissent in all communities. And I think we're seeing this a lot now when looking at marginalized groups who voted for Trump, or marginalized groups who take conservative stances, where it's like, just because you're marginalized, you shouldn't assume that you're always going to be more progressive, you're always going to be more liberal. Other people have different ideologies, other people are individuals, and they can make decisions for themselves. You know, like, just looking at Clarence Thomas for Black people. Obviously, he's out here saying that we shouldn't have, like, mixed marriages, we shouldn't be doing this, we shouldn't be doing that, and he's a Black man. Like, these people, this dissent exists, and diversity of opinion and nuance exist in all groups. But I'm talking specifically about the American Jewish identity because of this post claiming about the tokenization of Jews. And she brought this up in her post because she was talking about this specific sect of Orthodox Jews, I believe in Brooklyn, who are constantly used as, like, proof that not all Jews are pro-Israel, that there are Jews who are pro-Palestine, because the Orthodox Jewish group is pro-Palestine and has been pro-Palestine and has been actively anti-Zionist since the creation of the state of Israel, the modern state of Israel. And she calls them as Jews. She says that they're tokenizing because it's just like, it's one small sect of Jews that are not claimed by other Orthodox Jewish communities, and being like, well, you're not looking at the majority of Jewish people, you're not looking at everything, you're looking at this one specific sect. And therefore that's tokenization. And yes, it is to only look at Jews who only agree with you, that is tokenization. However, to actively not claim Jews as Jews who disagree with you erases the complexity of the Jewish community and the larger conversation at hand. And that's what bothers me when we have discussions about, like, self-hating Jews as a Jews, and actively try and distance ourselves from Jews with differing opinions than us, is that it's erasing the historical complexity of this community and of this conversation, which I think we need in order to better understand the Jewish identity. And that's what my research is around, is looking at the history of why do Jews interact with Israel and interact with these conversations the way that we do. However, it's also hypocritical, because we see this similar argument with Arabs, with Palestinians, with Arab Israelis, this tokenization of Arabs who agree with the Israeli government, Arabs who are pro-Israel, and Palestinians who are pro-Israel. We use this with the elevation of those who dislike Hamas, who view Hamas as the main evil, not Israel. And, you know, we say this as well. It was like the majority of Arabs in the United States are not pro-Israel. The majority of Arabs existing in Israel are not pro-Israel. But we see the elevation of like, look, Arabs agree with us because these people in Israel agree with us. The Arabs agree with us because these Palestinian activists agree with us. And you can't say that we shouldn't listen, that one side's tokenizing Jews for their benefit, when you're also actively doing the same thing with Arabs and Palestinian citizens. And so I think that's the one thing that bothers me, is that tokenization is working both ways on both sides. And so you can't say that these people are turncoats or whatever when you're actively doing the same thing, and that bothers me. But also, I think just like the messy American Jewish politics in this case extends past the like who's being tokenized, who's not, to this the trying to understand what the Jewish identity is and not really knowing. And that being a big problem with many of the arguments being made, is that there is a fundamental lack of understanding of what Judaism is, of what the Jewish identity is, and how we're supposed to interact with each other, with where we're living, with Israel, with history. And I'm not saying this as somebody who's like, I know the true history and I think everybody else is stupid. I don't know. And that's the thing that we have to admit, is that none of us know what we're supposed to mean to each other, how we're supposed to interact with each other, and where our loyalties are supposed to lie. And everything, because the conversations that I see us have are so confusing and so like nonsensical. I mean, we're out here like deciding who is and is not Jewish based off of these political decisions, based off of moral values. And to the point where like I'm seeing such an interesting blend of like the ADL, which is like the biggest Jewish organization nationally, is endorsing Trump and endorsing Republicans. Same thing with AIPAC, endorsing Trump, endorsing Republicans. But then you also see, you know, these organizations being like, oh, well, the majority of Jews are very progressive. The majority of Jews will vote Democrat. The majority of Jews do this. But it's like, okay, if the majority of Jews are progressive, if they're liberal, if they're voting Democrat, why are you now endorsing like these Republican candidates? And it's a lot of those conflicting things where we really don't know who we are as a community. We don't know who we are as a group. And it's so fascinating, because we're making all these statements trying to claim that we know, when it's like we don't. And so yeah, like we see organizations, you know, like literally cutting off their nose to spite their face. And so we see, you know, these claims of the ADL is endorsing Trump. We know that AIPAC has endorsed Republican candidates. And now we are seeing the organizations turn on each other based off of what they think Judaism is supposed to be. So now we have AIPAC and the ADL making claims that JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, and J Street are not actually Jewish because they view Palestinians as people. And, you know, but then we also see this thing that AOC has brought to light about how a lot of her voters also voted for Trump. But this has been something that's been very prevalent within American Jewish voting for a while, is that for, like especially for Orthodox, is they will vote Republican for a president or for like national politics, but then for local politics, they're all Democrat all the way. They vote for progressive measures, they vote for whatever. And so this disconnect is something And these contradictions are something that has existed for a while. And it really is leading us to ask, like, what, like, we are really unraveling through this identity crisis of a community, through this the public negotiation of culture, of ethnicity, of religion, of language, of history, unraveling so much of what we know about the world. I mean, even this conversation of like, is Israel a Jewish homeland, brings in the conversation of like, what is indigeneity? You know, like, are Jews indigenous to Israel? I don't just mean like the state of Israel, the modern state, but I mean like the land, the ancient land from 3,000 years ago. Like, are they indigenous from there? And it's like, well, they have to be indigenous from somewhere. These people have to emerge from somewhere. And then from there, it's like, if you are indigenous to a place, does that give you the right to rule over it if there are other people there? And I think these are questions that like are kind of thought of about the land back movement, but they're not brought up as violently as they are with this discussion. Or similar thing, like, if you are indigenous to a land, but you've been gone for so long, and so much of your culture has been shaped by other places you have lived in the diaspora, you know, let's ship of Theseus this thing. Is it the same culture? Are you the same people, or are you different? Because, you know, when the Jews left Israel, we were all one united Jewish group. And now we have Ashkenazi culture, we have Mizrahi culture, which in and of itself is made up of 50 billion other cultures. And Sephardi culture, then we have the Beta Israel from Ethiopia, we have the Jews from India, and so many of these cultures are unique to the point where they're irrecognizable to other Jewish cultures. And how does that influence what we see as a people? And that's why I'm making the argument that, like, Jews are in and of themselves a national group outside of Israel. Israel, as a modern state, has very little to do with a Jewish national identity. But we have the diversity. We have such a thing that it's hard. I mean, the main conversation that was happening before October 7th was like, who gets to be Jewish? Not in a like, who gets to be like the moral definitive, the political definitive, the correct version of the ideological Jew, but in a like, whose culture gets represented. Because when we talk about Jewish culture in the United States, we talk about Ashkenazi culture, you know, bagels, New York, rugelach, latkes. That's all Ashkenazi Jewish culture. But, you know, Sephardi culture has its own foods. It has its own takes on holidays. They have their own prayers. They have their own traditions. They have their own ways of dressing. They have their own look. You know, same thing with the various cultures within the Mizrahi category. Same thing with Ethiopian Jews. Same thing with Indian Jews. Like, there is so much diversity, so how come Ashkenazis are dominating the conversation? And same thing with, like, this negotiation of race, of the vast majority of Jews in the United States are white or white passing. And now we have this conversation of, well, are Jews white at all? And is it fair to say that Jews are a white religion or Jews are a white people when there are Jews of color, especially like Sephardi, Mizrahi, Beta Israel, Indian Jews, but even just like Ashkenazi Jews can be Jews of color, people who are adopted in, people who are converted in, people who, you know, marry into mixed families. Like, all of this is happening, and it's influencing how we are discussing and claiming people. And it's so fascinating that we're having this very public negotiation of like, what does it mean to be Jewish, especially what does it mean to be an American Jew, because that's also influenced how Jews have interacted with Judaism, as well as just Israel as an idea, a concept, and then as a modern state. Dov Waxman, who is a Jewish researcher about the American Jewish identity, especially in relation to Israel, makes the argument that like, American Jews are not Zionists, but they actually create this pro-Israel civil religion because and something else that I've noted, while people hold Israel as like this really high regard, this is the homeland of the Jews, they're not trying to move there. They're comfortable where they are. And so they create these new forms of Zionism where it's like political Zionism or American Zionism, where you become more American, you reaffirm your American patriotic identity through support of Israel, through either monetary support of Israel, either through political support of Israel, but you don't need to live there to be affirmed to be Jewish. And then you have the very different side where it's like a lot of Israeli Jews view themselves as more Jewish or more valid to be Jewish because they're not living in the diaspora. And then you have the question of what does it mean to be living in the diaspora, because there's an organization, Jew Belong, that just posted that it's really unfair that Palestinians get like eternal refugee status because Palestinians are still regarded as refugees, despite the fact that like they've lived in Gaza and the West Bank for a hot minute now. And they're like, well, how is that fair? That like they were refugees and now they're still classified as refugees. You know, my family was refugees and we're not still classified as refugees. And I'm like, what do you think diaspora means? Like, you self-label as being in diaspora and that inherently makes you a victim. That's similar to saying that you are a refugee, that you are a continued refugee because you're not out of your homeland. The only difference is that they're actively trying to get back to a homeland and you're not. You just want to make sure that your homeland can exist, or a modern representation of a past homeland can exist. So if you ever really felt the need to go there, you could go there. And I think that's also really interesting, is that Israel exists for most American Jews and most Jews internationally as a failsafe, not as a like, oh, this needs to exist because it's important to my identity. This needs to exist because whatever. It exists as a failsafe, which is to say that you're doing very well in the countries that you're in, and Jews are doing very well in the United States and in most other places. Granted, not all places, but most other places, even with this increase of anti-Semitism. Which once again, this then gets into the question of what is anti-Semitism? If we don't know what it means to be Jewish, if we don't understand the various like the push and pull of this identity, how can we qualify and quantify what discrimination against us looks like? And that's why we're all up in arms now about like bills being passed to include differing definitions of anti-Semitism, because they include different things. Like, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? Is calling for a Palestinian homeland anti-Semitism? Is criticism against the Israeli government anti-Semitism, especially when you have the question of Israel is supposed to be a state. It's a state and it wants to be a Jewish majority state, but then it also, as I said earlier, tokenizes the fact that it allows Arabs and non-Jews to be Israeli citizens. And so then you get into the question of like, if this is supposed to be a Jewish state and a Jewish homeland, do Jews internationally get a say in what the Israeli government does? And therefore, do they have to answer for what the Israeli government does? And if not, then is it truly a democracy if it's prioritizing one ethnic group's voice over another, because it does let in non-Jews? And if it decides that it wasn't to be a totally Jewish state, how ethical is it to expel the non-Jews who are living there? Like, you can't be both, in my opinion, but that's what it's trying to do. It operates in this gray area of it doesn't know what it wants. It doesn't know what it wants. And in not knowing what it wants, it clearly shows what it wants. It wants to be accepted, legitimized, which is also the thing, is like, to question the Israeli government is to delegitimize the existence of Israel, to try and hold them accountable for any military actions, to delegitimize the existence of Israel. And I think in many cases, like, a lot of the arguments that can be used to, you know, to bash criticism against Israel can also be used as criticism of Israel. You know, it's like, well, when one country fucks up, one country does this, that's legitimate, like, its legitimacy as a state isn't called into question. And it's like, okay, however, if you were to criticize a state for doing something, you don't view it as calling into question a nation's legitimacy. And so I think it's a lot of hiding behind words and technicalities and not saying the quiet part out loud. And I think it's ultimately because we don't really know what the quiet part is. And I think we don't want to accept what it is. And that puts this community in a really perilous situation, which comes down to the fact of not much is being done about anti-Semitism. In a way, because we're not focusing on it. We're focusing on anti-Semitism in a way that's distant from us. We're focusing on anti-Semitism as an abstract, as like the denial of Israel is an anti-Semitism. But we're not focusing on ways that it shows up separate to Israel, separate to this. And we also don't look at the ways in which these things are inherently entwined. Like, if the only reason that Israel needs to exist is because anti-Semitism exists, then why are we not doing more to fight anti-Semitism? I think is my question as well, is that it distracts us. You know, we want so badly a fail-safe and a safety measure that we're not looking to erase the anti-Semitism that does exist. And instead, we've created this new thing that's so dependent upon anti-Semitism for justification for its existence, that we've created a kind of like feedback loop of anything that is done is justifiable because there's this big, scary, looming thing overhead that is worse than that in our minds is worse than anything that we're doing. And I realized this has moved away from the discussion of the messy politics of American Judaism, but it all is. What I want to get across to people, especially non-Jews, is that we don't know what we're doing. We're terrified, and we're trying to have a conversation with things that we can't articulate because it's never been articulated for us, because our identity has been presented to us in such a broken way that we don't know how to rebuild the pieces. We don't know what our piece is. So sometimes we're just picking up sand. Sometimes we're picking up loose pieces of cardboard because we don't know how to rebuild something that we never truly had. Like, and I can get into the history of like why this is, and maybe I will if people want it. But it is such a messy topic, and it's so hard to be Jewish right now, not because of anti-Semitism or identity politics, whatever, but just because, like, internally, we don't know. We don't have this community, this united, strong community. I don't think anybody does at this point, because it's all built on hesitation and fear and tiptoeing around because you don't actually trust other people within your community to either have the same idea of what this identity means to you, to have the same background as you, to have the same want out of it that you do. And I think that's terrible. You know, I was thinking so much about how, like, I lost my community because the majority of Jews that I meet are pro-Israel and I'm not. And so they've called me terrorists, and they've, you know, like, kicked me out of places and, you know, sent me threatening messages. And I was like, wow, you know, it's really hard that I don't have this community. But then upon doing my research about American Jewish identity and that history, this kind of like fear and hesitation and like not being able to fully trust is something that's prevalent within so many communities across the nation, because you can never truly know who agrees with you and to what extent, and how that non-agreement, how that differing thing is going to affect you. I mean, even before October 7th happened and my opinions became known as differing from everybody else's, I was not the most welcome person anyway, because my dad is Jewish, my mom isn't. I'm a patrilineal Jew, and some Jews think that I'm not Jewish. You know, I'm queer and trans, and some people think that that's not conducive. I'm non-practicing, and some people think that that's not conducive. And that's why I'm saying it's this messy identity, because so much of everything that I've talked about influences how we as an individual American Jew sees the world. But there's no definitive way to be Jewish. And that's both amazing. That's one of the things that we say is amazing about us, is that like, oh, you can be, like, you don't have to believe in God to be Jewish. But clearly we're trying to put parameters on something that we don't know, that we don't understand enough to put parameters on. And we're not willing to accept other people within our community. And I think that's going to be the ultimate end of us. Not anti-Semitism, not assimilation, but the fact that we can't care about each other enough, that we can't respect each other enough, that we can't understand and know our own history enough to be a community together. We have to rely on these small individual factions of community because we as a whole community don't exist. And so that's why I think it's really interesting, where it's like we see posts that are like, yeah, we care about Israel because if we do one thing to one Jew, you do things to all Jews. And it's like, that's not true though, because you're so quick to dismiss Jews that don't agree with you. Yeah, so first video back, same rambling as usual. I hope you got something out of it though. So that being said, so long and thanks for all the fish.